Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Esch. I'm a senior in the International and Global Studies Department, as well as the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. And this is my presentation for the Virtual Thomas Undergraduate Research and Creativity Expo. Let's get started. The title of my presentation is Colonial Reverb, the Impacts of Settler Colonialism on the Policing of Prostitution in New Zealand and the United States. And this is my final capstone paper for my IGS 400 course. The goal of this paper is to compile and lay out examples of cultural colonial impacts and elucidate how these phenomena have shaped modern incarceration practices. I pose the question, is British settler colonialism to blame for the racism and homophobia in the criminal justice systems of its former colonies? This paper also explores the colonial roots of racism, homophobia, and incarceration, and asks, can our systems ever truly be just? My work asserts that British colonialism and its long-lasting cultural impacts are a primary cause of the racist and homophobic undercurrents of the American and New Zealand penal systems, especially in regards to the policing of prostitution. To prove this assertion, I use historical methods to better understand the history of coloniality and prostitution in both nations. And I was inspired by and use process tracing methods to try and prove a partially causal relationship between colonialism and the exploitative nature of incarceration. So far, we've kind of looked at a lot of different things, including the beginnings of race, homophobia, and criminal justice. Racism stems from white colonizers and enslavers' attempts to justify enslavement of minorities, specifically Africans, and the exploitation of lands and resources that were not their own. Homophobia, on the other hand, is a result of the indoctrination of Christian beliefs, largely by early Christian missionaries. Additionally, penal systems in both colonies functioned primarily as a means of social control in order for settlers to be able to gain greater access to indigenous resources. My research has also given me a lot more insight on prostitution laws in both the United States and New Zealand. In New Zealand, prostitution has been historically seen as a problem of public safety, whereas in the United States, prostitution was regarded as more of a moral failing for each individual. New Zealand currently has legalized prostitution as of 2003, whereas in the United States, the practice of prostitution is still illegal. Finally, we also talk about what this whole presentation is centered around, which is modern injustice in incarceration systems in the United States and New Zealand. In the systems as a whole, Black and Indigenous people, as well as queer individuals, are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. This is most obvious when looking at prostitution policing in both the countries. In the United States, Black women, specifically Black transgender women, are more likely to be harassed, accosted, and targeted, arrested also, on prostitution charges than any other demographic. And oftentimes the people who they kind of fear most, at least for actual transgender prostitutes, are the police officers themselves. That's kind of where they feel the most unsafe, because these systems have continually resulted in their disproportionate arrest and also violence. In New Zealand, while prostitution is legal, it's still somewhat stigmatized. And citizen action groups specifically tend to target transgender women, assuming that they're prostitutes, and then subsequently harassing them for both their gender identity and for this assumption that they are sex workers, which they may or may not be. Overall, I think that the discrepancy, specifically racially, in both the nations can be summed up really well by this graphic, in which it shows that 16% of the total population of New Zealand is Maori, whereas 52% of the incarcerated population is Maori as well. In the United States, Black Americans represent 14% of the total population, but 40% of those incarcerated. These numbers are impacted by racism, race-driven poverty, just all sorts of associations with individuals as being overtly more, criminal, which is rooted explicitly in racism and homophobia. My conclusions that I kind of pulled from this whole from this whole project have been that I can't definitively prove that colonialism is the sole cause of racism and homophobia in the policing of specifically prostitution in the United States and New Zealand. However, evidence does indicate a strong correlation between social and political ideas imposed by British colonizers and injustices in criminal justice systems of former British colonies. So the big why of this presentation is, you know, how can we fix this injustice that we see? Is it even possible to do so? And I argue that we can and we must. However, the first way to start is by using resources like this project to kind of explain the roots of modern injustice in two different penal systems in order to kind of provide a compiled collection of evidence on both the existence of the injustices in the modern era and their possible historical backgrounds. Thank you guys so much for your time and attention. My name is Maria Esch. Thank you.